Hello, and welcome to Kindred Spirits Book Club, the podcast where two grown ladies geek out about Anne of Green Gables. I'm Reagan Duffy. I am here with my lovely co-host, Kelly Gerner. And today we are welcoming a third grown lady, Dr. Emily Woster.
Hello.
Today we're going to be wrapping up our last episode on Rilla of Ingleside. We aren't done with our season just yet, but this is our last episode solely focusing on Rilla of Ingleside. You may remember Emily from last season on our episode called What Was Ella Montgomery Reading? She shared with us some insight into Maud's reading and writing life, and we thought we'd bring her back now to get some more tidbits about Maud, World War I, and Rilla of Ingleside. So welcome back, Emily.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm clearly very excited to be here.
We are so happy to have you. And Kindred Spirits, we're going to reintroduce you to Emily Woster. Emily is an English professor and director of the Writing Center at the College of St. Scholastica in Duluth, Minnesota. She was actually named after Emily Bird Starr, and she has a sister named Anne, of course. So absolutely sterling Ella Montgomery credentials right there. And as you might imagine, Emily has been reading Montgomery since childhood and studying her since her undergraduate years. Emily's dissertation was on Montgomery's reading and autobiographical practices. And lately, she's worked on a couple of large Montgomery projects, an online exhibit of the manuscript of Anne of Green Gables. You can find that online at annemanuscript.ca and on the Ella Montgomery Bookshelf project.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, Emily, we had such a blast talking with you last season. We knew we had to bring you back for this conversation. So last time you were here, you gave us a little bit about your long family legacy as Ella Montgomery fans. So would you share with us again how you came to be an Ella Montgomery scholar?
Sure. And as you mentioned, I think it happened maybe the moment I was named. My full name is Emily Suzanne. So my mom got the Emily and the Anne in there in both names, just to be sure. My sister is Anne Victoria after Jane Victoria from Jane of Lantern Hill. So we're just fully Montgomery names. And we knew this growing up that we were named it. Like, this wasn't a secret. We were told this is your namesake. So I first read the books as a preteen, but what's funny is so my mother was obsessed with Montgomery, obviously. But my first really big introduction to Montgomery's scholarship was my mother signed us up, as one does, for the Ella Montgomery conference that happens every other summer at the University of Prince Edward Island. She signed us up in the summer of 2002. The conference was happening about 2 weeks after I graduated from high school, and we rolled up to the conference. I'm 17. My sister is 12, and we went to a full-on 4-day academic conference. If you've been to some academic conferences, you know people don't generally bring children, especially children named after the books under discussion at the conference. So we were a little bit of a sideshow. It was so much fun, but I remember finding my calling. I remember where I was sitting. I was sitting in the main hall at the University of Prince Edward Island, listening to Dr. Betsy Epperly talk. And I had like this lightning bolt moment of like, you can do this for a living. And the rest is history. So I did it for a living. And I submitted a paper to the conference the next time around. I presented a paper when I was an undergraduate.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah, I'm doing it ever since.
That. I mean, I love it. You know, any story where someone is like, "Ah, yes, I found my home," and I think that's just
lightning bolts calling comes to you, and it's a little unusual. Not everybody necessarily dreams of being an academic, but I did, and yeah, I'm in Montgomery's words, it's very much my own alpine path.
I am then so thrilled for you that you get to live that dream. Well, since we're talking about Rilla of Ingleside this episode, can you share a little bit with us about your relationship with this book in particular? Like, when did you first read it?
So I first read it. I mean, when I first read the Anne series, I was 13-ish, 14-ish, somewhere in there. And I got to Rilla right in order. I read the book around the same age Rilla is at the start of the book, like 14-ish. And I remember this too, like feeling like Rilla was something really different. Like, it was coming home. I was reading Montgomery. I was still in this world of these characters I love so much. But all of a sudden, it's, there's geopolitics show up on the page. And not that the earlier books in the series aren't real. They deal with some really real human emotions. But Rilla is just something different. And I think two things happened since then. One is, for a long time, Rilla was my favorite of Montgomery's books. Now I have a hard time deciding this or Blue Castle. Depends on our Anne's House of Dreams. It depends on the day of the week. now, but for a long time, Rilla was my favorite. The other thing that happened is I became completely obsessed as a preteen with World War One. The Romanovs and World War One. Those are my two. When you're 14, that's what I checked out library books about. But Rilla really started this like kind of obsessiveness about reading World War One and trying to understand it. And so Rilla was the beginning of lots of other things for me, but also Rilla all by herself is just, it's a fascinating. So yeah, I've been obsessed with Rilla ever since I first read it.
Well, before we get started in earnest, just a quick reminder that if you are not already hanging out with us on Instagram, please do come join us over at kindredspirits.bookclub. That's where we share episode updates, cozy bookish memes, and glimpses of our L.M. Montgomery shelves and occasional dog pictures. If you've been enjoying the pod, please take a moment to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Pocket Casts, wherever you listen. Help us spread the word. Leave a review and let other Montgomery fans know that we are here. And another great way you can support us and support our show is by shopping the books we recommend at our bookshop.org link. We love bookshop.org. Not only do you support the pod, you also support indie bookstores.
All right. Well, let's get into our episode. And because this is our last episode about Rilla, we're going to do things a little bit differently this episode. So to that end, instead of one kindred spirit of the episode, I think each of us should talk about who we think is our own kindred spirit of Rilla of Ingleside. I'm going to start by nominating Dog Monday as the kindred spirit of Rilla of Ingleside. I've been reading this book since I was a teenager. I've come back to it many times over the course of my life, and still, like throughout this season, every single time we had to write about Dog Monday, I tear up. Dog Monday's simple loyalty and devotion bring just hope to everyone in this book. And yeah, when I think of Rilla of Ingleside, I think of Dog Monday. So how about you guys? Who is your kindred spirit?
I have to say that for me, the star of the show is Walter Blythe. I think his character development, his character arc is among the most interesting in the book. We really watch Walter just go through so much. He's struggling with war and violence on both like a philosophical level, but also a very personal level. I just think it's so interesting, right? He's so crystal clear about his values. And then he also is doubting whether violence is even the solution. It just all seems to reflect this like larger philosophical outlook where he values beauty and creation over ugliness and destruction. But then he has this change of heart and he finds a way to reconcile those beliefs with actually going to fight to preserve the goodness and safety of his home. It's so interesting. I feel like I see him somewhat differently every time I've read it. I think there's just so many shades to Walter. I think he's meant to be the Blythe kid that we love the most. How about you, Emily?
I think my answer might have been different, on my first reading than now. But for me now, and I know you've talked about this on the pod already, but Susan forever. Susan, especially now, maybe it's because I'm older, but Susan's humor, her one-liner, sometimes they're unintentionally funny, obviously. How many times is Anne, laughing into her hand so Susan doesn't see? So people talk about her with humor. Like that's the first thing they mention about her, but she is absolutely unflaggingly loyal to the Blythe family, but also to the community. She's willing to work so hard. I mean, literally manual labor, work so hard to make the community work. To me, that makes her like the kindred spirit of the story. And this sense of like, even when it's really hard, you just do, you do what you have to do. And, when I first read Rilla as a teen, I was her age. And so I would probably have said Rilla was I understood Rilla and her desire for a fancy hat. But I think now it's Susan is such a good symbol of so many of the themes of the story and probably reflecting some things Montgomery wanted us to know about that supporting your community is a really, really powerful thing. And that support sometimes requires so much work, but also at the end of the day, this is Susan being the best kindred spirit. Age doesn't matter, and it's never too late to take your own honeymoon. I mean, what other lesson is there than that? She's the best.
I love that so much, Emily, and we love Susan around here. Well, so along those same lines, if we each picked out our own kindred spirit for this episode, why don't we all share a favorite quote from Rilla? I'll start, and I'll stick with my Walter theme and share one of Rilla's remarks when she is kind of dealing with learning of Walter's enlistment. So Anne tells Rilla that she must be brave, and she can't make it any harder than it already is for Walter to join up. Anne says, quote, "There is a call greater and more insistent than the call of our love. He has listened to it. We must not add to the bitterness of his sacrifice." And Rilla responds, quite perfectly in my mind, "Our sacrifice is greater than his," cried Rilla passionately. "Our boys give only themselves. We give them." And Maud is doing something so interesting and thoughtful with Rilla's impassioned italics in this quote. Nearly every pronoun is emphasized, right? Our sacrifice is greater than his. Our boys give only themselves. We give them. All those words are italicized. And it's kind of like played for teenage melodrama. But when we look past that, it's also centering the women who are giving so much to this war effort. That's what this book is about, right? It's making sure that the sacrifices and the suffering of the women on the home front didn't go unnoticed or unchronicled. And I think it's also kind of subtly shifting the burden of that suffering and sacrifice from the young men, who we all know about, to all the women and families who saw them go and who waited for long, scary, uncertain years for their return. Because when it comes to the people we love the most, we always hope to suffer so they don't. So Rilla is able to perfectly capture the pain of not being able to alleviate your loved one's suffering just with this sentence.
I would say my favorite Susan line these days is, "Mrs. Dr. Dear, I have made up my mind to be a heroine." And I absolutely adore that sentence. And I know like this theme of like people on the home front being kind of everyday heroes has been discussed, and that's just all throughout the novel. But I've been thinking a lot about what it means for like seemingly normal people. And we, especially like in the US, we like our heroes often to be these larger than life, almost mystical people who do impossible things without breaking a sweat. That's often how we picture heroism, but that's not really what heroism. If you ask anyone who's done something the heroic, they usually say, "I just did what everybody else would." They never kind of live up to that mystical quality, because it's not mystical. Susan decides she's going to be a hero. She makes up her mind about it. She knows how hard it's going to be. It's not something bestowed upon her. She chooses it. Like, it is a verb. Heroism is a verb. And I think that's a really big lesson of, I'm choosing to be a hero for my community. And that's the kind of world changing reality that happens in this book. I mean, I think if you ask anyone who read the book, Susan is a hero. She makes up her mind and she totally does it. She lives up to that. And I think that's something we could all maybe learn from. Like, you might have to just make up your mind one day that you're going to do heroism.
Yeah. That theme throughout the book is obviously something we're talking about, and how applicable it feels today.
For me, I think one of the reasons Susan's really been speaking to me lately, and this idea of community and neighborliness and kind of these little tiny choices you make, is because I live in Minnesota. And the last couple months have been, that is the word, there's an Atlantic article about Minneapolis. Neighborism is like kind of this new idea. That's the philosophy, is like, what's real life is neighbors helping neighbors. Susan's story has really been like front of mind for me, because she embodies that. You have to decide to be a hero. That's, I think that's so real these days. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about my favorite quote. And I'm going to give myself a challenge here, you all. Let's see if I can do it. Because if we're going to talk about Dog Monday, then I think this quote, which is my favorite moment in Rilla.
Reagan, I love you, but I do not believe you have this.
I typed it without crying today.
That's so different than reading it out loud, though, because
yeah.
Good luck. I'm sending you all my
Here we go. I'm not looking at you guys cry though. So, thousands of trains had Dog Monday met, and never had the boy he waited and watched for returned. Yet still Dog Monday watched on with eyes that never quite lost hope. Perhaps his dog heart failed him at times. He was growing old and rheumatic. When he walked back to his kennel after each train had gone, his gait was very sober now. He never trotted, but went slowly, with a drooping head and a depressed tail that had quite lost its old saucy uplift. One passenger stepped off the train, a tall fellow in a faded lieutenant's uniform who walked with a barely perceptible limp. A black and yellow streak shot past the station agent. Dog Monday stiff, Dog Monday rheumatic, Dog Monday old, never believe it. Dog Monday was a young pup gone clean mad with rejuvenating joy.
I will stop
there. I will stop there. I won't read the whole thing, but that gone clean mad with rejuvenating joy every time.
Do you remember reading that for the first time?
Yeah. And I read it, and the dog that we had growing up was my dog. His name was Elwood. He was absolutely the most faithful, sweetest dog. I am fairly sure he was like lying next to me while I was reading that moment. I'm like petting him, being like, Elwood would do that for me. He might not, but I thought he would. For today's story club on wrapping up Rilla of Ingleside, we really just wanted a chance to talk about a few of the things we couldn't quite manage to fit in anywhere else in this season. You would think with 11 episodes before this, we would have talked about everything there is to talk about with Rilla of Ingleside. But no, we've left some stuff out. So think of this as sort of an extended puffed sleeve episode.
Well, yeah, so I've been calling this episode Oops All Puffed Sleeves, like that Oops All Berry cereal.
It's all the treats. In many ways, Rilla is the book that we still feel like we feel like we're still discovering it, even all these episodes later. No matter how you look at it, there's so much to talk about with Rilla. Poetry, symbolism, metaphor. We've got romance and angst and coming of age and grief. This book has everything, and we've had so much fun discussing it.
And then in addition to all that, there's this really interesting conversation about how Rilla of Ingleside as a book stands among its literary peers. You know, World War I inspired a generation of writers and poets, as we discussed a little bit in our Walter episode, and it is just one of the catalysts for the modernist movement in literature. When we talk about the great books that came out of this war, I feel like we always are talking about like Hemingway and C.S. Lewis and F. Scott Fitzgerald, but I really think Rilla of Ingleside can be spoken of and taught in the same way we talk about like A Farewell to Arms. I mean, Emily, am I crazy? Is this an insane thing to say?
It's not insane. I think it absolutely should be. I mean, there's nothing else quite like Rilla out there, especially in Canadian lit, in American lit. I don't think there's anything quite like it. I taught Rilla once in a class, and it was a class on intertextuality in literature. So basically like talking about all the ways that different texts like overlap and call to one another, like adaptation or illusion. And in one unit, we read letters to and from the home front in World War I. We read all of Rilla of Ingleside. We read a little bit of Farewell to Arms, but not all of it. I wanted Rilla to have a little more room. And we read Scott Westerfeld's Leviathan, which is a steampunk retelling of kind of World War I, sort of an alternate.
That's a
World
more
War
contemporary book, right?
Yeah, that's a contemporary YA novel. And it was a really fun unit because students, of course, could find all these threads. But I think the students, they knew the letters were this real contemporary, like documentary history. They knew Hemingway was important. They knew Leviathan was this genre story. And so it's picking out all the steampunk elements. But Rilla was the one, not just because it's set in the real world, but Rilla was the one they sort of like, I get her. I relate to her. I see myself. It wasn't like they didn't like the Hemingway, but I think being able to read all that together was a really interesting way of learning about World War I and all the different ways it gets painted in different parts of literature.
Well, one of the topics I really wanted to talk about with Rilla this season was how much this book reminds me of Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, which is another one of my very favorite books. So Rilla and Mrs. Dalloway are both war novels, kind of, right? Neither is set on a battlefield. Both are these like deeply domestic books about like very ordinary women leading very ordinary lives. But they are full of these tiny details of their everyday lives, like hats and dresses and dinner menus. And yet the war is looming so large in both books. It's like just off the page, but it is always there in the minds of the characters. Mrs. Dalloway gets a lot of critical acclaim and scholarly interest because it's a great example of British modernism. So the book is told in a stream of consciousness narrative. You're right inside Clarissa Dalloway's mind as she's kind of making her preparations to throw a party that evening. You've got all of her remembrances and observations, her hopes, her regrets, her like shopping lists, like whatever is just sort of rumbling through her mind on this ordinary day. She's not the only point of view we get. We kind of shift around a little bit, a few other characters, one of whom is a World War I veteran who's suffering from PTSD. I know that a stream of conscious narrative is not everyone's cup of tea. I love it. It always feels kind of like unfettered and whirling, like there's no rules, no plot, just thoughts. And like some of those thoughts mean nothing and some mean everything, but you don't actually know until you're done reading. So it might not be for everyone, but it is generally considered to be one of the modernist masterpieces. Then thinking about Rilla of Ingleside, which is of course a very different book. It's more vernacular, it's more popular. I think a lot of people would find it a much more accessible read. But as I was reading Rilla this season, I couldn't stop seeing parallels. And by the time I was done, I almost believe that Woolf must have been inspired by Montgomery in some way. Like truly. Rilla was published about 4 years before Mrs. Dalloway. And there's just so many ways these books overlap. I couldn't stop thinking about it, or maybe it was just that being a woman at home during the Great War felt the same, whether you're living in London or small town Canada. Like, I'm not sure. Maybe these two writers both just had very similar lived experiences and wrote books that reflected that. But at any rate, I think Perhaps the biggest point of similarity in both books is reflecting on the chasm that the war created between the time before and the time after. The war causes Rilla to mature into a, quote, capable womanly girl far sooner than the Blythes would have otherwise expected of their frivolous, fun-loving youngest daughter. And in Mrs. Dalloway, which is set about 4.5 years after the end of the war, Clarissa says she feels unspeakably aged and thinks of her life as a solemn progress of time from the war to the 1918 influenza pandemic to the present moment. And that, of course, is a feeling that we are all very familiar with and have spoken about a lot this season. There are certain events that seem to divide our lives into befores and afters. So also in both books, the war touches everything, right? As Clarissa Dalloway is walking through London, shopping for the party she's hosting that evening, so much of what she sees makes her think of the war and what was lost. And I kept thinking as I was reading Rilla that if Anne Blythe was running errands in Charlottetown in June of 1923, she might be experiencing many of those same observations, like seeing the town she knows, but also noting the changes and the loss, even among other signs of like progress and growth. And so in both books, the characters are kind of haunted by these memories of the people who don't come home. And the characters are also called upon to like respond to the war in their everyday life. In Rilla, I think this is really big and obvious, right? She's organizing Red Cross societies. They're selling victory bonds. It's a little quieter in Mrs. Dalloway, but it's still there. The aftermath of the war is kind of hanging on when a character visits the tomb of the unknown warrior. And then there's this like uncanny silence that happens at 11 a.m., which of course calls back to the annual 11 a.m. silence observed on Remembrance Day. Even on perfectly ordinary days, the war and its memory is everywhere. So I kept thinking of Clarissa as being a kind of like near future version of Anne. Like they're both matriarchs and mothers, respected members of their community. They're also both hostesses, which I think is really notable. I think both of them are filling their homes with people and life and ideas and poetry as a kind of defense against the grief and dark and loss of the war. Clarissa specifically thinks of her party as an offering, a creation, right? She's creating a party, she's shining a light into the dark. And I think Anne is doing a lot of that same work in Rilla of Ingleside. She's also finding a way to shine a light into the grief and darkness of war. Both women seem to understand the value of community and connection in these terrible times. And they're both expected to like uphold a certain amount of like artifice. They're both expected to, quote, keep calm and carry on. Clarissa specifically says that she tries to be the same always, and she hides all her faults and jealousies and fears from the people in her life, even her dearest. Anne is doing the same thing. She strives to send her sons to war with an encouraging smile. She won't allow them to see her grief or to see her cry. Because neither woman is truly able to be herself, I think the characters also share an interesting amount of internal isolation. They may be surrounded by their daughters and their husbands, their housekeepers and servants and friends, but they are not truly known. Clarissa very specifically says that she feels invisible, unseen, unknown, that the person who used to be Clarissa is now Mrs. Richard Dalloway, and everything that that entails. And similarly, Rilla observes that her mother's eyes never laugh now. Clarissa is the woman that Anne could become in a few years, more cut off from her emotional truths, reminded constantly of the war and of her losses, living half in the present and half in the past, still doing her best to be a good wife and mother and community leader, but always feeling that chasm left by the war.
Yeah. I think that's a really good comparison to Rilla. This similar, separate story, different story, but there's all of those same threads. And I think that really speaks to women's experiences of World War I specifically, but also of a lot of wars where the men are going off fighting and women are left behind to hold it all together, and what that does even emotionally, that emotional toll it takes on them.
And even things like you said, like that image, I'm still having to go shopping and do the normal things when nothing really is what normal used to mean. And I think that's a really good thread between all of these stories.
You know, the other book that really came to mind as we were reading Rilla of Ingleside as kind of a companion of telling a similar but different story is All Quiet on the Western Front by Erich Maria Remarque. It was published in 1929, and it's a semi-autobiographical novel of a German soldier based on his own experiences on the front lines of World War I. And it's often called one of the greatest war, or really anti-war novels of all time. I read this in college for a history class, and it profoundly impacted me at the time. The rawness of this book made me deeply appalled at the hellishness of war and humanized the history that until that point had been very interesting in like an intellectual kind of way, but not in an emotional kind of way. If you've never read All Quiet on the Western Front, the main character, Paul, is a young German man. He's 19 when he joins the German army, and he's inspired by the patriotic speeches and nationalistic fervor that is just everywhere in Germany. Like Jem, Paul thought of war as a grand adventure for the glory and the duty of his homeland. And it made me think of several of the conversations we've been having this season. It makes me think a lot about how we've discussed Jem and the nationalism on the Canadian side made the Germans out to be a faceless barbaric force. And it also made me think about our recent discussion in our Prophecy of War episode. And in that one, we kind of picked apart Mr. Meredith's argument that any war in which fine young men were compelled to lay down their lives for their country will ultimately be a triumph for good. And we said at that time, the loophole in that is that isn't that what the German young men also believed? And this is such a great example of exactly that. Paul and his friends are just as convinced as Jem and his comrades that by enlisting, they are defending the German way of life that is currently under threat. You know, both of these wars are pitting armies of young, idealistic men who think they are doing the right thing for their country. And I kept thinking that if Walter had read this book, he would never have been able to enlist, that it humanizes the young men in the trenches far beyond what their national or political ideologies are. So All Quiet on the Western Front it's Walter's story, it's Jem's story, it's Kenneth's stories. It's the one that Maud couldn't have written because that was not her experience. When Walter writes to Rilla in his last letter that he's not scared of death and that he thinks that life would be harder for him than death would be now because he doesn't think he could ever find life beautiful again. That echoes what Paul experienced. There's these two different quotes from All Quiet on the Western Front that sort of seem to me what Walter might have been experiencing. In this one, it says, "What do they expect of us if time ever comes when the war is over? Through the years, our business has been killing. It was our first calling in life. Our knowledge of life is limited to death. What will happen afterwards, and what shall come out of us?" And then there's this other quote. "Now we would wander around like strangers in those landscapes of our youth. We have been consumed in the fires of reality. We perceive differences only in the way tradesmen do, and we see necessities like butchers. We are free of care no longer. We are terrifying indifferent. We might be present in that world, but would we be alive in it? We are like children who have been abandoned, and we are as experienced as old men. We are coarse, unhappy, and superficial. I think we are lost." And I think that's what Walter was afraid of when he talked about not being sure that he was brave enough to face life after the war.
Oh, those two quotes are devastating, Reagan. What a
Absolutely.
gut punch.
All Quiet on the Western Front is such an interesting companion to Rilla because in this book, war is quickly stripped of its patriotism, of its ideals. It's kind of the anti-Rilla of Ingleside in a lot of ways. On the home front, the families lean into that idealistic view of war. It's the only way to survive this constant worry and uncertainty. And it seems like in the trenches, the only way to survive is to drop all idealism and to survive minute by minute. All Quiet on the Western Front is a devastating book. It's vastly different in emotion than Rilla, which is hard and sad, but it's also full of life and hope. And ultimately, it's a celebration of women on the home front and of the bravery of the Canadian soldiers, whereas All Quiet is a condemnation of the war experience from the soldiers themselves.
So Montgomery read on All Quiet on the Western Front, and I'm going to tell you what she thought about it. But before I tell you, I want to say that one of the things that I think is most interesting, and one of the reasons I think All Quiet is a really, really kind of almost important companion text to Rilla, has to do with some of the reasons that Montgomery did not like All Quiet on the Western Front. She didn't read it until 1929. And so she comments this. She says, "Have been reading All Quiet on the Western Front, the war book that is the sensation of the day, probably because of the sensation in it." And then this sentence is so unfair of her. She says, "It is something of a fake, as the author of it is said to never have been in the trenches at all," which isn't true, but she must have read that somewhere. This is her again. "But it probably reflects the reality of the war very accurately and is a book of considerable power and pathos apart from said smut, like the dirtiness, the violence of it. But to write a book now without dragging latrines into it is to be outmoded." She objected to some of the parts of All Quiet that are the most graphic, the most real, but she also admits it's probably a really accurate portrayal. Now, keep in mind, Montgomery is reading this almost a decade after the war. She wasn't a soldier. It's hard for me to wrestle with that because I love All Quiet is such an interesting read for all the reasons you mentioned. It's such an interesting read alongside Rilla for all those reasons. Like Rilla's story has there's hope and there's things to work for, but the story of the trenches was very much not hope and very much feeling like there was no forward progress. And so I think both of those are true. And so Montgomery's response to it is really, really interesting that she didn't like it, but she understood the value of it is telling.
Oh, that is interesting. So she kind of objected to, I guess, the gruesomeness of it and the gore.
The graphicness.
Right.
Yeah.
Would have preferred maybe a more sanitized telling, but was also able to see that like that actually probably did happen exactly like that.
She was also, so she read it in 1929. By then, Montgomery was kind of bristling at some of the tendencies in modern fiction. She wasn't a fan of the modernists, maybe because of taste, but also because the modernists and the modernist movement weren't really fans of her either.
Right.
And that was a big tension later in her career. Another, I think, companion text. So All Quiet is an amazing companion. It's it is the front line story. I think another companion text, especially alongside Miss Dalloway too, is Vera Britton's Testament of Youth, which is a really interesting read. So it's a memoir of Vera Britton growing up, and she talks about how naive she was as a teen. She's very Rilla, and becomes a nurse in World War I. And in a lot of ways, it's the story that it's a little bit of what Rilla's story could have been, signing up to be a nurse and get sent over somewhere. Britain's from the UK. So she was stationed in the UK and then in France for a little while. But it's this naive young woman who comes of age in this world that's beyond her control, but she rises to the occasion. And Britton, even in the foreword to Testament of Youth, it's published after the war, she tried at first to write it out as fiction, and she just couldn't do it. She felt like she couldn't capture it, the stories and how she felt or how it felt accurately in a novel. So she wrote it as a memoir instead. And so, she loses a brother fighting in France. She reflects on the changing roles of women. And in her case, Testament of Youth is her experiences during the war led her to becoming a very vocal pacifist later in life. It was after the war. That was a political goal of hers. But there's a quote in it that, just thinking of our theme, my thinking about Susan and thinking of our themes of community, Britton says, "When I was a girl, I imagined that life was individual, one's own affair, that the events happening in the world outside were important enough in their own way, but were personally quite irrelevant. Now, like the rest of my generation, I've had to learn again and again the terrible truth that no life is really private or isolated or self-sufficient. People's lives were entirely their own, perhaps, and more justifiably, when the world seemed enormous and all its comings and goings were slow and deliberate. But this is so no longer, and never will be again. Since man's inventions," she's talking about airplanes, "have eliminated so much of distance and time, for better or for worse, we are now each of us part of the surge and swell of great economic and political movements, and whatever we do as individuals or as nations deeply affects everyone else." She's young when she had this realization that, what I do affects everyone, for better or for worse, because we are so much more interconnected. And I think that maybe is a quiet theme in Rilla, but it's definitely there. It'd be really interesting to read all these together. Read Miss Dalloway, read All Quiet, read Vera Britton, read a memoir, and read Rilla all together. I think that'd be a really interesting way of looking at all the different nuances of the war.
Well, Kindred Spirits, that's your summer reading challenge. All right. Well, okay. So back to Oops, All Puff Sleeves. What about characters that we didn't get to talk about enough? Because I know I kept wishing we had time for a Mary Vance episode. We never quite got to spend enough time on her fascinating character arc, which begins with Mary being sort of like ambivalent about the war, but, very protective of her sweetheart and not wanting him to enlist in a fight that she is not sure she believes in personally.
Isn't Mary's point, like, what does it matter? We're here in Canada. This is over there.
Yeah.
Like, it's none of our business, really. So why should my fiance fight for something so far away?
I like how she's very much running the show for her and her fiance. She's like, well, since I'm not sure, he's not joining up. It's like,
I think that is going to be Marion Miller's relationship, obviously.
Oh, yeah. I'm happy for them.
And he's thrilled about it. He's
Yes.
thrilled about it.
So the attack on the Lusitania became Mary's sort of activation point, and she then does send Miller off to enlist. At this point, she's fairly bursting with patriotism, right? She becomes sort of the patriot of Glen St. Mary.
The standard bearer all of a sudden.
telling everybody else how to send their brothers and husbands and sweethearts off to war. I mean, it's just real interesting take. But Mary's real scene to shine was when she saved baby Jims from a particularly awful bout of croup. In this chapter, it's a few days before Christmas, but a winter storm has made travel impossible. Anne and Gilbert are in Avonlea. Miss Oliver is off in Lowbridge for some reason. The other Blythe children are all away at school. So it's just Rilla, Susan, and baby Jims at home when Jims takes gravely ill. Susan says she's never seen a croup like it before. Rilla is sure that this is false croup and that Jims's life is in danger. All of a sudden, like an angel, Mary Vance shows up at the door. And this is absolutely hilarious because what had happened is Mary had been visiting with other neighbors when this terrible storm began. And so then she got stuck at their house for 2 days. And finally, these neighbors annoyed Mary so much that she decided that she would rather leave and walk through the snowstorm to try to make it to Ingleside on foot than stay with them.
I love how Mary arrives. Like you said, it's so funny. Blows in with the storm and
Yep.
with about as much power and grace just swoops on in. And it's so beautiful.
She admits she almost gets stuck in a snowdrift on her way to Ingleside, but she sort of implies that even that would have been preferable than staying in the house with the other neighbors. Anyway, she's insane. But it's lucky she arrives when she does because Mary has actually seen this type of illness before, and she recognizes that Jims has what she calls diphtheria croup, which I take to mean is diphtheria, which even today has the potential to be fatal if not treated in time. And we thankfully do have a vaccine for diphtheria now. Mary administers an absolutely insane remedy that she once heard of. She has no idea if this is going to work, but she does correctly judge that Jims is sick enough that it was kill or cure at this point. So the remedy is to sprinkle sulfur over the fire and then hold Jims over it to breathe in the sulfuric fumes. And then that would break up the diphtheria mucous membrane, which is wild. Rilla said that she didn't know how she stopped herself from snatching Jims away. And honestly, I kind of can't blame her because this sounds barely humane, but it does work. The sulfur smoke seems to have opened up Jims's airways and he can breathe once again. It's a really fun redemption moment for Mary Vance, right? The older Ingleside kids, they like Mary, right? Or they at least kind of tolerate her. She's, what do they say? She's like a habit they can't get rid of. But Rilla has disliked her since the codfish incident in Rainbow Valley. Rilla thinks Mary is unladylike, coarse, and boastful. But after this, she decides that Mary has earned the right to boast as much as she wants. Rilla kisses Mary, says she's so grateful for her, and Mary replies matter-of-factly, well, you ought to be.
Mary knows her worth. She knows her worth. I love that about her.
We love this for her.
It's true.
Especially after such a dramatic cure. I feel like your house would smell for days after this.
I love the Saving Jims chapter. I'm glad we get a chance to talk about it because it's such a clear reflection of Anne saving Minnie May. Obviously, she's calling back to that pivotal moment, which, by the way, did Anne never tell Rilla that story? Because if she had, she would have known to use Ipecac. Because
Anne has 25 children. She can't tell the same stories.
And Gilbert's a doctor. Surely there'd be Ipecac in the house.
Right. If she had heard this story, I'm sure she could have accessed something like Ipecac, right? Which works the same way. It's helps them cough up that thick mucous membrane that I guess is choking them. The same thing with the sulfur, if it works, right? For both Anne and Mary Vance, their knowledge of how to handle croup is derived from their experience in this neglectful, abusive upbringing in which they're raising babies as young children themselves. So the pampered Rilla, who's the daughter of a doctor, would never have gained this knowledge on her own. She would never have needed to. And for both Anne and Mary, this moment brings them gratitude from people who are not positively inclined towards them. Although in Anne's case, it was because of a terrible mistake with the cordial and the currant wine. And in Mary Vance's case, it's for something she did on purpose, chasing baby Rilla with a codfish. I kind of don't blame Rilla for still being traumatized. This incident's from Rilla's point of view, from the person who is paralyzed and doesn't know what to do, rather than from the point of view of the person doing the saving. And then we also have that nice contrast between Anne's humble response in saving Minnie May and Mary being pretty impressed with her own self, although it is well earned. She did save him, so she does get a pass for me on that one.
It's such a beautiful callback for readers, but that perspective shift is so interesting. And Anne saving Minnie May helps save Anne's reputation with an adult, with Miss Barry. But this time, the melodrama works in restoring a friendship between peers. And that's such an interesting change where Anne is learning to prove herself and behave, but also helping the adults around her figure out what children might actually need. Where this story isn't about like the adults learning how to deal with children or a child learning to fit in. It's about peers trying to like sort out kind of a friendship. And I love that because it's Rilla still has things to learn. Mary does know more than you give her credit for sometimes, but it's a little different. Like in Anne's case, it's Anne shouldn't know all this. She's grown up too fast. That's a little bit of Mary's story too. Like she shouldn't know this. She's had to learn this, by necessity. But in this case, it's to help peers reconcile something. And I think that's an interesting shift for a Rilla kind of character.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so speaking of the collected misadventures of Rilla and Jims, we also never really talked about the Mrs. Matilda Pittman episode. Again, we just didn't really have a good place to stick it in terms of where it fit with our other themes. So this is a story about Jims falling off the train, Rilla jumping down after him, and then realizing they were stranded in the middle of nowhere. Again, we've got bad weather. The weather turns, and Rilla decides the best thing to do is to stay at a friend's home nearby. And when it turns out that those friends are not home, Rilla just decides the best thing to do is break in and stay. I mean, it's pouring. She's got a toddler with her. I guess that's the best you can do, right?
Yeah, perfectly normal thing to do in the days when you couldn't just dial for an Uber.
I love it so much. It's such a classic Montgomery little detail. It's something right out of her short stories. Like, we're going to give you this wild interest, and then we're going to introduce you to this unforgettable side character that you might not ever see on the page ever again, but you'll never forget her. And I love those little bits because it feels like reality, but also not at all. Like, but yeah, because Rilla's reasoning there is interesting at best.
Right. There wasn't anything anywhere else around anybody else's house that they could walk. In any case.
And she's literally breaking and entering, which is so funny to me.
Well, after spending the night in Rilla's friend's empty home, total strangers burst in on Rilla and Jim sleeping in the guest room. None too happy to find that these surprise visitors. Turns out Rilla's friend doesn't live here anymore. She recently moved, and the current occupants are a little cranky to find an uninvited guest or two in their spare room. Honestly, fair. Like, you get home from a long day, you've traveled through the storm, and all of a sudden there's people sleeping in your spare room. So Rilla tries to explain who she is, why she's there. They don't believe her because we fell off the train and then decided to break into your house. Does sound a little odd. Rilla tries pulling the "do you know who my father is" card by trying to invoke Dr. Bly's good reputation. The current homeowners, who are called the Chapleys, don't care. They don't buy any of this. Anybody could say they are Dr. Bly's child.
Yeah. They're like, I don't think so.
We don't, she's not carrying ID. We don't know. Rilla tries to salvage the situation by offering to pay. And the Chapleys are like, well, okay. Like, well, we can talk about that. Until all of a sudden, a tiny little older woman bursts in and tells the Chapleys that this is ridiculous. They're not going to charge a poor traveler in need of a night's lodging, especially not a young woman with a small child. So it turns out that this is Mrs. Matilda Pittman, the mother-in-law of Mr. Chapley, the mother of his wife, Amelia Chapley, and she is not going to allow him to be so cheap as to not take decent care of their uninvited guest. Mrs. Pittman explains to Rilla that she's got some pull over her daughter and son-in-law because she has the money and they want to inherit it. Jims is absolutely delightful. This kid has got great timing. He charms Mrs. Pittman. He calls her pretty lady and he gives her hugs and kisses. That just delights the elderly woman. Rilla tells Mrs. Pittman over breakfast all about Jims, about his mother dying, dad at war, Rilla raising him. And she also confides that she's worried that Jim's father will be returning home from war soon and he's not going to be able to provide for Jim the same way that the Blyes have been able to, especially because he has a reputation for being kind of lazy or shiftless sort of worker. As Rilla and Jims are leaving, Rilla once again offers to pay, but Mrs. Pittman waves her off, delighting in her visit with this sweet little boy and spunky, brave Rilla, who stood up against the Chapleys. Well, in the next chapter or two, Rilla finally hears of Mrs. Pittman, who has just passed away and left a trust for Jims, providing for him even if his father is never able to earn much money. The interest from the trust will take care of his day-to-day expenses, and the bulk of the trust will be available to him when he's a young man, start his life out well. Is this kid the luckiest kid alive? Jims. He was saved by Rilla in a soup tureen, saved again from diphtheria by Mary Vance, and now saved from a fall off a moving train, and then falls right into a trust from Mrs. Pittman. So good job, Jims.
You know, that classic story of the orphan in the soup tureen who falls off a train and then lands in a pile of money. I love this bit because it's such a classic Montgomery little coda to his story. But I've thought about this many times as I wonder how much of this is Montgomery just kind of making sure that the reader's like, I promise you Jims is going to be fine. I'm not going to let any orphan on the pages of my novels go without. And so she goes full great expectations, gives him a wealthy benefactor. And it's like Montgomery can't help but like just double down and make sure we all know Jims is going to be just fine. But she does it in the most humorous way possible.
Exactly. Well, and it's funny because you've got Mrs. Pittman obviously is shades of Aunt Josephine Barry, but again, swapped because Anne jumps on Miss Josephine Barry in the spare room. This time it's Mrs. Pittman finding Rilla and Jims in her spare room. And instead of being angry, she's completely charmed by Jims, who wakes up and calls her pretty lady, which this kid, he's going to grow up to be a charmer. He's so good.
How annoyed are the Chapleys, by the way? Well, and then speaking of some of the metaphors and symbols that we sort of glossed over in our discussions, I'm astonished that we didn't get to really dig into the metaphor of the piper. We certainly talked about the piper over the course of 2 books now, Rainbow Valley and Rilla of Ingleside, but we've never actually explored or gone into detail about what the piper is. The reason I think this matters is because the piper is not clearly one figure from legend or myth, but instead I think he's referencing at least 2 different people and 2 different ideas, both of which I think are pretty important to understanding these books and Walter's response to the war particularly. So the first sort of most straightforward interpretation of the piper is a character known as the Highland Battle Piper. So in Scottish lore and legend, bagpipers would play on the battlefield and their songs would signal troop movements and tactics. Their songs would also boost troop morale and they intimidated the enemy. Sort of an ancient tradition that was then revived after the Jacobite rebellions, and that carried through all the way to World War I, when Highland pipers literally did bring their pipes to battle in the trenches, which is such an interesting thing to think about in sort of a more modern warfare tableau. So because of the high visibility, it was an incredibly precarious position. During World War I, over 1,000 Highland battle pipers were killed. And so I'm guessing that is probably what Maud was referring to in Walter's visions, a traditional Highland battle piper. I just am thinking because of that Scottish cultural legacy on PEI and in the Canadian Maritimes, it just seems like that's kind of a safe bet. But of course, there is a second famous piper of legend, right? The Pied Piper of Hamelin from medieval German folklore. And that I think might be more familiar to us now. I for sure always read Montgomery's pipers as the Pied Piper. The Pied Piper, of course, is the story of the musician with the magic pipe who was called to the town of Hamelin to collect all the rats and to run them out of town. The pipe lured all the rats away, but when the piper tried to collect payment from the townsfolk, they refused. So then the piper used his magic pipe to lure the children out of town too. 130 children are lured away to a mountain cave and are never seen again, but for 3 children who remained. One who is deaf and couldn't hear the music, one who was unable to walk and could not go, and one who is blind and could not find the way. And so which piper is it that Walter sees? Is it the brave Highland battle piper leading his countrymen into adventure and glory for their homeland? Or is it the deceitful Pied Piper who took an entire town's children away to repay a debt? And I think this is an interesting mystery in Rilla of Ingleside, right? Or maybe we can just decide that it's both, right? There is both this call to adventure and this call to destruction that's inherent in Walter's visions.
That's interesting. I also always assumed it was the Pied Piper, this irresistible call pulling children away, that they follow happily to who knows where, but their parents are left behind to worry and wonder what happened to them and to mourn. And I do think in Rainbow Valley, when Walter has his first vision, he's specifically reading a book of fairy tales and telling stories from that book to the other kids in Rainbow Valley. So to me, that always directly pointed to the Pied Piper. Not only that, though, I feel like the metaphor around the Pied Piper works so strongly here. This idea of the piper taking the children as payment because the adults cheated him. And that's just such a metaphor for war, right? Children drafted to be soldiers to pay for the messes that their parents, their ancestors caused. And then once we activate metaphor Reagan, like we can keep going. So the three kids who don't go, the one who can't see, who can't hear, and can't walk, that also seems like a really strong metaphor to me, right? The child who can't walk are all of the young men who were physically unable to participate in the war, but otherwise would. The child who can't hear is oblivious to the call. He doesn't hear the call at all. So he represents those who are oblivious to the call of duty. And the child who can't see, he gets lost, misdirected, turned around. There's part of him that wants to follow the call, but are afraid or pacifist or didn't agree with the aims of the war, the way that Walter feels, where he's hearing the Piper's music, but he doesn't know how to follow it. Mm-hmm. I didn't know about the Highland Battle Piper, so maybe I can certainly see how that imagery could come into play as well. It just feels to me like the way she writes Walter's vision seems to imply that the call pulls them away whether they want to or not. Like Jem wants to. Walter, it feels like a supernatural force pulling him against his will. Walter isn't inspired by the Piper's music. He's haunted by it. Jem would probably be inspired by a Highland Battle Piper. I could totally see that, but not Walter, right? Walter writes in Rilla, he's trying to resist that call, but he hears it all the time. It's pulling him away like the blind child. He hears it, but he's lost and he doesn't know how to follow it. So I'm not convinced by the Highland Piper theory, but maybe Maud's and Walter's Pipers is the Pied Piper of Hamelin, but playing the bagpipes rather than a flute for his eerie music.
I really like your interpretation of the Pied Piper because there's that like sinister energy. It's like consistent with men sacrificing their bodies and their youth for this terrible war.
I love all of this discussion because I absolutely think it's both of these images and then some. And I think those reflect a little bit of both of Montgomery's maybe feelings, or at least some of the going feelings about the war. You know, there's this kind of patriotic bagpiper bravely leading a charge and sort of a devious trickster leading children, actual children, away from homes. Yeah. And so in Jem's case, he's marching to something. He's following that Highland Piper into battle. He's going somewhere. But the other one is leading children away from something. And that's Walter. Like, that's the kind of being drug out of your home for it. And this whole theme just absolutely fascinates me. And I think both of these images of the Piper sort of let Montgomery, whether she intended one or not, they let her kind of put both again on the page.
While we are on the topic of unexplained mysteries of Rilla of Ingleside, can someone please explain Whiskers on the Moon's proposal to Susan Baker to me? What on earth was that man thinking?
I mean, Susan's great. That's what he's thinking.
He's living in an entirely different reality.
He really is.
What's also funny about the scene is it's one of the few that is sort of narrated by Anne's point of view.
Yeah. As Anne would tell it, quote, "A week later, Mrs. Blythe, coming up from the village late in the afternoon, paused at the gate of Ingleside in an amazement which temporarily bereft her of the power of motion. An extraordinary sight met her eyes. Round the end of the kitchen burst Mr. Pryor, running as stout, pompous Mr. Pryor had not run in years, with terror imprinted on every lineament, a terror quite justifiable, for behind him, like an avenging fate, came Susan, with a huge smoking iron pot grasped in her hands and an expression in her eye that boded ill to the object of her indignation, if she should overtake him. Pursuer and pursued tore across the lawn. Mr. Pryor reached the gate a few feet ahead of Susan, wrenched it open, and fled down the road, without a glance at the transfixed lady of Ingleside."
Montgomery is so good at humor. She's so funny. I love that this is written from Anne's perspective because it's almost like Rilla could not even handle this.
No.
You need a grown woman to report these events accurately because they are amazing.
Well, so Anne asks Susan to explain. She's sort of like gasping in shock and like choking back laughter at the scene. Susan gets a hold of herself. She goes back inside, washes her hands of the situation. Like very literally, she goes inside and washes because she had shaken hands with Whiskers on the Moon, and then she like wants to cleanse herself of that contact. And then Susan tells Anne the whole sordid story. She explains that Whiskers on the Moon arrived unannounced and that she was taken aback by his visit, so she let him in and offered him like the barest hospitality while he brazened out a proposal. Susan is shocked and offended. She says to Anne, "Some men, I am told, consider a little preliminary courting the proper thing before a proposal, if only to give fair warning of their intentions. But Whiskers on the Moon probably thought it was any port in a storm for me, and that I would jump at him." So I think that Susan's shock and offense comes as much from like the manner of the proposal as, the differences in their political beliefs and her disgust with Whiskers on the Moon generally. And it doesn't help that he tries to curry favor by complimenting the cat either. So he tries to pet the cat, then the cat bites him. And you know what, you guys, this is where I'm starting to see some of Susan's superstitious beliefs like falling apart, because she both believes that Whiskers on the Moon is a German spy and that the cat, when he's in his Mr. Hyde mode, is like connected to the Kaiser. So then why would the cat bite Whiskers? Come on, Susan.
Well, this is also the only moment in which she like vaguely likes Doc because he has bitten Whiskers on the Moon.
Right, that's true. So Whiskers on the Moon sort of like reels back. He's just gotten bit, and he's like, so then he calls the cat a varmint. Susan is mad about that, even though she also doesn't like the cat. Like, this is just...
Yeah, he might be a varmint, but he's our varmint.
Susan then responds with this like kind of like nonsense remark about how the cat knows the difference between a Canadian and a Hun. Whiskers on the Moon misses whatever Susan is trying to imply there. Sure enough, he asks her to marry him. Susan says she never would have imagined she would get her first proposal at age 64, but that she will not be boasting of this one anytime soon. So Susan tells him she's not going to marry him if he were the last man on Earth, to which he responds, none too tactfully, "Why, I thought you'd be only too glad to get a chance to be married." Famous. And Susan, in her own words, absolutely loses her head in this moment. She tells Anne, quote, "Do you think I had a good excuse when a Hun and a pacifist made such an insulting remark to me? Go," I thundered, and I just caught up that iron pot. I could see that he thought I had suddenly gone insane, and I suppose he considered an iron pot full of boiling dye was a dangerous weapon in the hands of a lunatic.
That has to be one of the funniest lines in all of Montgomery. In the hands of a lunatic.
Perfect. So I can only assume that at that point, Anne had to excuse herself to go upstairs to laugh.
I don't know how Anne kept a straight face through any of that explanation.
But I also love this because it's another little callback to Anne of Green Gables, because how many times in Anne of Green Gables does Anne say something preposterous and Marilla kind of has to like cover her mouth and laugh or close the door? But now we get this moment of Anne having to do this. But I love this moment because it's with Susan, and Anne can't laugh at her, but it's what has to be one of the funniest things Anne has ever heard in or seen in her life. But she's wonderful enough to hide the laughter. Susan's not ready to laugh about it yet.
No, it's all a little too fresh for Susan.
Exactly.
All right. So, Emily, one of the reasons we were so excited to have you back on the pod, besides, just having tons of fun chatting with you, is getting your take about Rilla of Ingleside from Maud's journals, because we are not deep in the lore of Maud's extensive journals and letters, but we love knowing people who are. So the question we keep coming back to this season in various iterations is, what did Maud herself believe about the war? We know she used some of her own journal entries to inspire parts of Rilla, or Rilla inspired some of Maud's journals. But what did she think about the war, both as it was happening and in its immediate aftermath when she would have been writing Rilla?
These are all such good questions. And I think the first thing to know about the connection between Montgomery's journals, but also just her day-to-day life during the war and Rilla, is that home environment that we see, home environment of the Blythes, the breathless wait for the mail every day, the way everybody is up and down in their moods depending on like troop movements or battle news, the strange and vivid stress dreams. Montgomery had those too. The need to do everyday things and get through life, go to church, make bread, keep a routine, feed the baby, like those things, the start and end of really active Red Cross chapters and work, all of those like day-to-day domestic things are all in Montgomery's journal. Montgomery lived that part of the story 100%. She's active in the Red Cross. She's wrangling the Sunday school kids. She's rolling bandages. She's organizing people. She's breathlessly waiting for the mail and following troop movements. And that part of Rilla is very like viscerally real to Montgomery. So that experience is hers. But I also think, so like a lot of if you were to kind of try to summarize the feeling of the war in the novel, the feelings of those of Anne, Susan, Miss Oliver, Rilla, I think Montgomery's beliefs about the war and all their nuances are pretty well reflected in the novel. It just kind of diffused. Maybe she gives different characters sort of sentiments that are in her journal. But in the end, I would say it's yes, that the novel, like Montgomery's feelings about the war were kind of akin to Rilla's. This shock, or Anne's even, it's shock at first. Then it's like fear, then it's kind of this birth of a new sense of what it means to be Canadian. The Battle of Vimy Ridge did that. She had a new understanding of what it meant to be Canadian, sending your sons to fight. You're part of this commonwealth. You're part of this common good. And so she very much had a lot of those patriotic, noble war feelings, that it was worth it. And that's me being kind of reductive. Montgomery feeling like this was a patriotic duty to participate in this. But that doesn't mean she shies away from some of the other views. Montgomery felt very similarly about the US president at the time.
Woodrow Wilson?
About Wilson, his indomitable letters, he kept writing letters rather than joining up to help. That's in Montgomery's journals. So I think Montgomery probably falls more squarely in the patriotic, the Scottish Piper side of things, but she leaves room for some of these other ones. She doesn't have much tolerance for, as we see with Whiskers on the Moon, like true pacifist, whether his are true or not is a different story, kind of leanings that she's not a fan of, at least on the page. But for the most part, she kind of has this patriotic duty sense of the war. But what I think is super interesting about rereading her journals of this period is that her journal shows very much on the page. We have this beautiful summer day, June 28th, 1914, Montgomery's journal. She talks about attending this wonderful Sunday school picnic. Now, she's partially in charge of the Sunday school. Her husband's a Presbyterian minister, and she reads this long kind of bitter passage about, we do this for the children. Sunday school picnics are so much work and the cooking and the planning, and it's not as fun as an adult. And she goes on and on, but she's talking about a Sunday school picnic, and it was a beautiful summer day. A few days later, her next journal entry is on August 5th, 1914, and the first sentence says, England has declared war on Germany, ! And you just see this complete 180 from Sunday school picnics, and her son Chester's about 3, and the day to day, and she's writing and all these productive things, and you see like her journal, and just like everybody's lives, just completely shift. This is now a war journal, and I am documenting things. So she has these stress dreams like Miss Oliver. She doesn't have the wave one, but she has a dream that like all of a sudden she hears someone banging on the door, and she answers the door, and a soldier in khaki runs through the house. She uses passages in the journal, sometimes whole cloth and sometimes little images in the novel. So like she has this line, the first time she ever saw an airplane in her journal, she quotes from Thomas Gray's Elegy in a Country Churchyard. It's a long poem. And she uses that in Rilla when Rilla first sees an airplane. I think Rilla talks about it in a letter maybe to Walter, forget which. And then Montgomery repeats it again in a letter to one of her pen pals. So it's like she's trying out some of these stories. But yeah, the everyday experience of the war in a small town in Canada is absolutely reflected here. And I think that is one of the ways she sort of says her opinion of the war. Look at all these noble people stepping up to do the work that's necessary because she'd had experienced it herself. I mean, and there's so much there. So I highly recommend her war journals are really interesting. They're an interesting mix. But the first thing I think of when I read these journals is Montgomery turned 40 in 1914. She's got young children at home. She's got a 3-year-old, and then she has a stillborn son in a couple years later, and then her son Stuart is born all during the war. And then she doesn't write Rilla until like 1919-ish, 1920. She starts writing Rilla. Very impressive career. And what would otherwise be a full-time job as a Presbyterian minister's wife homemaker. But she somehow or another captures Rilla at 14 so perfectly. And that amazes me, because if you read her journals, her day-to-day is the day-to-day of a 40-year-old mother, wife, author. She tries to control the story of her own youth, but she's really good at painting the story of a young girl. I also wonder to what extent Montgomery gave Anne, adult Anne, some of her feelings about the war, because Anne is closer in age. Anne is experiencing World War I, maybe a little older than Montgomery is. That other little piece, so at the start of the war, her son Chester is 3, and she's completely in love with him. He's this like chubby little adorable baby who says amazing things. August of 1914, her baby son Hugh is stillborn. I mean, that was devastating for her, but that's how the war started for her, was losing a child. And her grief about that is really, really intense. Her son Stuart is then born the next year in October of 1915, and she's so excited that Stuart comes along and brings kind of this joy back to her life. Other thing that happens that she talks about in her journals that I think is fascinating is in the war years, she finishes writing Anne of the Island, which she desperately wanted to call Anne of Redmond, writes Anne's House of Dreams and publishes it, writes Rainbow Valley and publishes it, all during the height of the war. I don't know when she had time to sleep. I have no idea. She somehow managed to make Anne's House of Dreams just a complete escape from the rest. And she doesn't talk much about the process of writing Anne's House of Dreams in her journal, which fascinates me.
When she's writing Jem, baby Jem, does she know she is going to send him to war? It's very clear, obviously, in Rainbow Valley that she knows that those children will be experiencing the war. She puts all that foreshadowing.
Anne's House of Dreams. Yeah, she's writing it. I mean, maybe, I guess, I don't know if Montgomery had squared yet that like Anne's and Gilbert's youngest would be this age at World War One, because, you know, she's not really clear on the dates of any of
She didn't have to send him to war. So it's just interesting, this idea of like this baby is born that Anne is absolutely in love with, especially after the tragedy of Joyce, and whether she knew she was going to do that to Anne.
I don't know for sure. Rilla then is written after the war, and Montgomery like mines her journals to do that. To some extent, it's because it's also the period where Montgomery is recopying her journals. So it's a perfect time to write a story that mines your own journals while you're sitting there and recopying them out. And so while Rilla on one hand captures these minute little details of day to day, it's written in retrospect. And I love that mix of like, this is Montgomery's memories as recorded during the war in her journal. And so we read Rilla and it's happening, you know, up to date to the minute really quickly in front of us. And I think that's a really interesting, where Anne's House of Dreams almost happens in this like mystical, beautiful moment of time in the past that Anne and Gilbert will never get back again, but neither will we. And I think that's just a really interesting note. The other thing that fascinates me about Montgomery's journals in this period, just because this is my area of study, I've been fascinated with Montgomery as a reader forever. Montgomery's reading during the war, because the woman also had time to read for fun. Again, do not know how she did all this, but her reading shifts a little bit too. Early in the war, she's reading some big poetry and her usual kind of things. But then during the war, she reads a couple of these giant history books, Lecky's History of Rationalism, Macaulay's Histories, plural, and Grote's History of Greece, which is like, I think, 2 or 3 volume. She spends time with these big history of Greece, these massive republics and these stories of worlds bigger than her own. And I can see exactly why you would turn to that kind of reading during war, of like, let me go back in time. There's been wars before and people have come through it, and we've rearranged our society accordingly. And so you're kind of looking for answers. She also reads, and I love this, she reads Samuel Pepys' diary. If you know Samuel Pepys' diary, it's this huge diary of London taking place during lots of plague and illness in London. There's lots of parallels to COVID in Pepys' diary too. Of course, she'd love to read a diary of someone who's trying to, although Pepys is a character and a half, but Pepys is this one lone person trying to make it at home during greater world events. No wonder she reads that during the war. So you see pepper, like throughout the journal entries, you see little references to that.
Yeah.
The 2 other things that I think are interconnected with this too, the last thing I'll say about some things in the journals, are 2 things that happen at the end of the war. She publishes her sort of autobiography, her memoir, The Alpine Path, in a magazine. They wrote to her asking, would you tell us the story of this famous authoress? And she sent them a draft. And of course they answered, but like, you didn't tell us about any of your love affairs. And so she puts those in the journal. She writes out all the men that she's known and been involved with, most of them sort of with a little bit of a dry, I was never in love with so and so, things like that. She left that out of the memoir, by the way. So she publishes that. But the really big thing, and I put this as part of the war years, even though the armistice had been signed, is the death of her cousin Frederica Campbell in 1919 from influenza. Montgomery would say this: you could mark her life before Fred died and after. Like, there is a line in the sand between the 2 parts of her life. And she writes about it this way. Fred Campbell was her cousin, her closest friend from childhood, this other woman in the family who left the island and was pursuing some version of a career, but was also a dear friend. And Montgomery writes a little bit about the kind of discussion of this influenza pandemic kind of coming in 1918. She gets the flu herself when she's visiting the island in 1918. And then Fred gets it in, and she called her Fred or Freed, depending on who you're talking to. But Fred dies in 1919 and Montgomery is completely shattered. And I think that experience, it leads to a lot of reflecting on her part. It's around the time she starts recopying her journals. It's around the time she writes, the light has gone out of my life, is what the way she describes it, losing this friendship. And while it happens after the war, I mean, the influenza pandemic is sort of packaged with the war in history as like these massive world-changing events. And those are the parts of the journal that are the most world-changing event, just intruding on Montgomery's everyday life right here on the page. And it's, those journal entries are actually like, I get emotional. They're really hard to read. And she writes about Fred for years and years and years afterwards. These long entries about, I remember when we did blank and we used to laugh so much and do such and such. One of the few photographs we have of Montgomery laughing is when Fred is there in their dining room. And those events in the journals, I think, I don't know how that squares with when she started writing Rilla, but I wonder at what point she decided, whether it was in 1918, 1919, somewhere in there was, Rilla's published in 1921, when she decided, I need to tell this war story. And it lines up that the Blythe kids would be the ones in it. And I don't know her calculus on when she started and what inspired her. There's so much happening in her life. There's all these little bits in the journal that show up in Rilla or inspire other writing that might have come from these big events in the journal, maybe where she decided, I need to tell a story of the home front. I need to tell this story about these world events hitting a small town really hard.
So one of the questions, and I don't know whether you can answer this, but Kelly and I recently had a conversation in our episode about the prophecy of war around this idea of John Meredith's conviction that not only was God on their side, but that the horrible cost of war was necessary for some great stride or growth in the future. That reading it now in our times, that we wouldn't necessarily agree with that, but I'm curious if there's anything in her journal that tells us where did that idea come from? Did she agree with that?
Yeah, I think there's so much to that. So I think, especially in Whiskers on the Moon case, but probably John Meredith's case, there's Montgomery maybe parroting things she's reading in the paper, parroting the party line about what the war is for and how it works, and that God is on our side and we're making this sacrifice. But at the same time, like, you see what she does to those characters. Whiskers on the Moon is the butt of a joke, and John Meredith is never anything other than like a paragon of society. He is the moral heart of the community. And so I don't think that's totally an accident. I think she's pushing on a couple of those things. After the signing of the armistice in her journal, she writes, "The Great War is over. The world's agony has ended. What has been born?" in italics. "The next generation may be able to answer that. We can never know fully." There's so much to unpack there, but the "we will never fully know" is almost a little bit of her absolving herself of responsibility. We, the older folks, will never know. We won't live to find out. It's not for us to decide. The next generation may be able to answer what's been born. But if you ask Vera Brittain and the World War I poets, they would say, well, our generation has been completely decimated. So how are they going to answer that question? Yeah. And so I think there is that strain of Montgomery's, like, this was all just and good to a point. It was painful. I can't answer what's coming next, but other people might. She deeply felt the devastation of it, the violence of it. And she mentions the price, but even then, how could she possibly know, even then at the fall of 1918, what that price would actually mean to her generation? And so I was looking just for fun. I have some images from a couple of her scrapbooks. She kept scrapbooks through her whole life. And lo and behold, right before we recorded, I randomly clicked on one of the pictures I have of her scrapbooks. And there's a little clipping in a scrapbook where it must have been shortly after the war, the magazine Every Woman's World, which was the same magazine that published her little autobiographical sketch, The Alpine Path, had clearly asked her about the war. And she wrote an answer. And I don't know if this is published anywhere else, but preface this to say, magazine editors of the time often took some creative liberties with things. Montgomery would admit this. Sometimes they judge. But what they say, Ella Montgomery, writer of graceful romances, strikes a sterner note in her message to the readers of Every Woman's World. And according to them, quote, Montgomery says, "You ask me what I hope to see as the outcome of the war. 1, for the world at large. 2, for women in particular. I am not of those who believe that this war will put an end to war. War is horrible, but there are things that are more horrible still, just as there are fates worse than death. Moral degradation, low ideals, sordid devotion to money getting are worse evils than war, and history shows us that these evils invariably overtake a nation which is for a long time at peace. Nothing short of so awful a calamity as a great war can awaken the remembrance of a nation that has forgotten God and sold its birthright of aspiration for a mess of pottage." That is her kind of saying, that God was on this was right and just. But she says, but I do hope that as a result of the war, humanity may relearn its lessons so thoroughly that it will not need another such drastic schooling for many generations. Which, as she learned not 20 years later, it didn't happen. I hope that the heroism and fortitude evoked may leave a rich legacy of character to races yet unborn. I love that line. And I hope that a great awakening to high issues, moral, spiritual, and intellectual, may follow the agony of conflict. She's seeing the the lofty ideals of some of this. But then she answers the last question. I love this. To my knowledge, maybe one of the most feminist things you can find in Montgomery. She says, in regard to women, I do not expect that the war and its outcome will affect their interests apart from the general influence upon the race. But I do hope that it will in some measure open the eyes of humanity to the truth that the women who bear and train the nation's sons should have some voice in the political issues that may send those sons to die on battlefield. I don't know how much of that is Montgomery and the editor. She put it in her scrapbook though. So on one hand, she sees there's maybe lessons that this is what happens to great societies. If there's too much peace and people are getting too greedy, war happens to like teach some lessons, which I think is a little bit, I'm uncomfortable with that whole idea.
Right, like we're resetting the table here.
Yeah.
And something greater will rise. I'm uncomfortable with that, but she sees that, but she does hope that we'll learn our lesson and we won't have to do this again. And that part is really hard because, I mean, she gives that sort of sentiment to Rilla that, that I hope we don't ever have to do this again. And of course they do. And that last little bit about women, I'm not sure about that one. I mean, I know she says things like that other places in her journal, but kind of this statement of like, we did all this work. We supported the war in the ways we could. Surely the bare minimum you could give us is some say in whether we do this again. And that's pretty powerful. Just like any real human being, Montgomery's opinions shifted, or the way she articulated those opinions shifted. It's hard to pin down, like, here's the sentence that encompasses all of it. And that's hard to find. But I think Montgomery still exemplifies how maybe good it is to be a real person whose ideas shift and change, and how you express them and how you show them and how they change in retrospect. That's all there too. And that's really real.
Wow. Well, this is a ton of food for thought. Thank you so much for sharing all of that with us, Emily. So this is our last Inspired by Rilla. So let's do some last Inspired by Rilla recommendations. I kind of have a very frivolous recommendation I've been waiting to share for several episodes, but all of our recent episodes have been pretty heavy and I didn't feel like I could make it fit the theme. In honor of our beautiful, vain Rilla, I'm going to recommend the two best hair tools I've recently discovered, one for curls and one for straightening. Let me put this context out for you listeners. You need to know that I am as low maintenance as it possibly comes in regards to my hair. I always air dry it. I rarely use any product in it. Very low maintenance, extremely lazy about my hair. It is 90% of the time in a ponytail or a mom bun. But over Christmas, my niece got this magical automatic curling iron, and we all had so much fun playing with it. And it was so easy that when I got home, I ordered one for myself. So it is the Tymo, Tymo automatic curling iron. And you kind of like just drop a section of your hair in the slot at the top, press a button, it winds the hair around the barrel without pulling it. And when it beeps, you just like pull it down and it's a perfect curl. And I can do my entire head, and I have a lot of hair. I never use a curling iron because it takes for freaking ever and my arms get tired and I am lazy. And this thing does my hair in like 15 minutes, my entire head, and it looks great. And the curls last, like the next day, it still looks really good. So I've been actually curling my hair on a regular basis. This has never happened in the history of ever.
I have to say, Rilla, it sounds like Rilla would love this. But you know who would love this? Jo March, trying to curl Meg's hair.
Yes.
Or Cecily from The Story Girl.
Oh, yes.
Who wants nothing more in her life than to have curly hair.
Beautiful curls. Yeah.
Anyway, this thing was so good. I had to look and see if they had a version of a straightener, because while my hair is straight, it's not like blowout straight. Like it gets frizzy and it has a little bit of wave. And they do. It's called the Tymo Ring Hair Straightener Comb Brush. And it's not automatic, but you just take a section of hair and you comb it through with the ring comb. You kind of hold it at the end. And then poof, it's perfect shiny hair. It's so easy. And again, I can do my whole head in like 15 minutes and I have a lot of hair. So I recommend them both. They're both very reasonably priced. Do understand my hair is a very easy texture. Like it's not super curly and it's not super coarse. Now I can
have a lot of hair.
But now I can get like supermodel hair on Random Tuesday. So if that's what you want, and if that's what Rilla would like, I recommend these two things.
I love that recommendation. And I'm also going to dive in on the idea of totally frivolous recommendations. I think this is perfectly aligned with our Oops, All Puffed Sleeves episode. Although yours are reasonably priced, mine is not. I recently spent far too much money on a hand lotion based solely on the pretty packaging. I don't regret the money spent at all because I freaking love this stuff, and I think all the kindred spirits will love it too.
Wait. We often have very different ideas on what's reasonably priced. So if you're saying it's not reasonably priced, how much is it?
wheel,
Kelly.
$75.
So a splurge.
So definitely in the splurge category. I will say you can buy refills, which are less expensive than $75, but to get the like whole product with the little case and everything, it's $75 the first time you buy it. So anyway, the hand cream is called TheraPlush Overnight Repair Treatment. The brand is Soft Services. So I was seduced by the packaging, which I will attempt to describe because podcasts are in fact an audio medium. It's a refillable case. It's blush pink. It's like a very weighty plastic, and it kind of looks like a stack of rings, maybe like all stacked up on top of each other. Like it's kind of textured in that way. It looks really beautiful on like your bedside table, or I keep it here at my desk in my office. There's a little indent in the lid where you can put on your rings where you use the hand cream. The lid is like magnetic, so it sort of like clicks into place. It's like super satisfying to use. It's like everything about the ritual. It's like weighted and magnetic. It just feels very luxurious. And then the cream itself is lovely. It is thick but not greasy. It's got a very subtly fragrance, so it's not going to interfere with your perfume or anything. There is some retinol in it, not a super high concentration, but I have noticed that some of the spots on my hands are lightening, so that is nice. I don't know, you guys, it is stupid expensive, but pretty darn great. I'm going to use it until I run it into the ground, just like Rilla and her little velvet green hat. So
Love it.
That's the Soft Services TheraPlush Overnight Hand Repair.
I love it. And it sounds like something that Rilla or someone would gift to Susan Baker and she would never admit to using and loving, which probably means it's really good. So I'm going to go on a different tack, but I think what I would recommend, given some of the threads of the conversation we've been having, it was something that I didn't think I would care much about, but I can recommend. I gifted it to something I gifted to my mother-in-law and it went over beautifully, is if you've heard of Storywork, and it's this sort of, I don't know what to call it. I don't know what they call themselves, but it's sort of like prompted journaling or remembering. And so you can gift it, you can do it for yourself, which is something I should probably do someday, is gift it to myself. But what you do is when you gift it to someone, you get to choose all these prompts and you can have it send the person a weekly prompt, a prompt every 2 weeks. It elicits stories and stories you maybe have never heard. So my husband and I bought this for my mother-in-law, and I was pretty sure she would love it. We gave it to her and we chose these prompts about like, tell us about your first car, tell us about your first date. What's something you're the most proud of? When did you do XYZ? And she loved it. She took it really serious and added pictures. At the end of the period of time where you would send these prompts, you get sent a book, a published version of, and it says like the story of Becky on it.
Oh.
And it has these prompts, and I really, really loved it. And she really loved it too, because as we were talking about, I'm thinking about Montgomery's journaling and recopying. I'm thinking about Rilla's letters. I'm thinking about Montgomery's scrapbooks. There's sort of a little push to remember some of these things, or to have people in your life remember them. You can do it in lots of different ways. There's cool different models of how it can send prompts. You can do that. You can record audio, but I just love it. Like if there's someone you know whose stories you want to get down on paper, it's worth asking, but also your own stories. I think this would be a great way to kind of force yourself to write some stories. I think that would be really special and kind of in keeping with Montgomery's tendency to record everything.
Oh, I love that. Okay, so inspiration for us and the kindred spirits to keep some of their own journals.
That is a great recommendation.
It really is. Oh my God, what an episode we have had today.
I know. And Emily, we've been so delighted to have you here. You are the perfect person to wrap up our discussion of Rilla of Ingleside with.
Honored to be part of the Oops All Puff Sleeves episode. I'm putting that on my CV.
Yes, please. If listeners want to find more of your work, where should they look for you?
Sure. So the best place to find me, you can find some of my work at annemanuscript.ca. That's where the entire digitized manuscript of Anne of Green Gables is. It's worth spending a couple hours and diving in. That's super fun. But the other place is the Montgomery Bookshelf Project, where I'm sharing scans of and stories about some of Montgomery's most interesting reading experiences. And you can find that at kindredspaces.ca/bookshelf, or just look up the Montgomery Bookshelf Project. And just a little teaser, I did just add something Montgomery read during the war called My Home on the Field of Honor. And it was another memoir of World War I. And I won't say much more about it other than it's really interesting. And my note about it gets to mention stories of the home front during the war, Mark Twain, and antique French wallpaper, all in one paragraph, which is a fun teaser to go check out the bookshelf.
Oh, wow.
I was like looking that up right after we hang up right now.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Emily, we absolutely cannot wait to hang out with you and all the other amazing scholars and attendees at the Ella Montgomery Conference this summer. So listeners, if you've been thinking of going to the conference or making the pilgrimage to PEI, this June is the perfect time for that. So we will drop the link to the registration in the show notes. If you can't make the conference in person, there is a virtual option for attending, and you are definitely going to want to do that.
And I should say, too, I have to give a little plug. One of our keynote speakers at the Montgomery Conference this year is none other than Megan Follows. And you're welcome to attend. The Megan Follows talk is available for free. You can attend. You can register for that separately.
Odds on whether or not I cry seeing Megan Follows.
I wouldn't even take that bet. There's none of us will be safe during that one.
We are so grateful to everybody who's been listening and sharing the podcast. Truly, the messages and reviews mean the absolute world to us. So please feel free to drop us a line either on our Instagram, or you can email us at kindredspirits.bookclub@gmail.com. We absolutely love hearing from you. And if you haven't yet, you can rate us 5 stars wherever you listen and leave us a review. It helps more Anne fans find our cozy little corner of the internet. If you email us about your review, we will send you a sticker and a thank you note. So thank you so much for tuning in today, and we hope you will join us in 2 weeks for another episode of Kindred Spirits Book Club. We will be moving from Rilla to the last book about the Blythes, the collection of short stories and poems titled The Blythes Are Quoted. Our recap of that collection will be our next episode. So until then, Kindred Spirits.
Bye, Kindred Spirits.
Bye, everyone.